look. Starting at number 10, we have the Battle of Carthage. The Battle of Carthage was fought in 698 between a Byzantine expeditionary force and the armies of the 5th Umayyad Caliphate. After losing Carthage to the Muslims, Emperor Leontius sent his forces and they entered the harbor and were able to recapture it, as well as the city. Now the Arab forces fled, and as the tale goes, the Christians landed and the citizens hailed the ensign of the cross, and the winter was idly wasted in the dream of victory or deliverance. Then next up we have the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah. The Battle of Al-Qadisiyah was fought in the year 636, and this was the decisive engagement between the Arab Muslim army and the Sassanid Persian army during the first period of the Muslim expansion. Now it resulted in the Islamic conquest of Persia and was key to the conquest of Iraq. Then there was a Battle of Covadonga. Now the Battle of Covadonga was the first major victory by a Christian military force in Iberia following the Muslim Moors' conquest in the region in 711. Taking place around a decade later, the victory at Covadonga assured the survival of a Christian stronghold in northern Iberia. From the perspective of the following 7 centuries though, this view of the battle was the valid view, since the battle assured the independence of the kingdom of Asturias, and it was that kingdom that eventually became the center for a new Christian rule over the entire peninsula. And for the Muslims, this was the first serious setback in the Muslim campaign in southwestern Europe. At number 7, we have the conquest of Maghreb. The Muslim conquest of northern Africa continued the rapid Muslim military expansion following the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 AD. By 642, the Arabs controlled Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Syria, and they had invaded Armenia and were ending their conquest of the Persian Empire with their destruction of the Persian army at the Battle of Nihawand. The Arab military advancements in North Africa first began, and this went on for years, and which it furthered the spread of Islam. Then in the year 644 at Medina, Caliph Umar was succeeded by Uthman ibn Affan, during whose 12-year rule Armenia, Cyprus, and what is now Iran would join the Islamic Empire. The Battle of the Bridge comes in at number 6. Now this was fought between Arab Muslims led by Abu Ubaid Thaqfi and the Persian Sasanian Empire forces led by Bahman Jaduya. It was the only major Persian victory over the Muslim armies, and the Muslim forces had taken Hira, and the fall of Hira shocked the Persians and they began to take the Arabs more seriously. Halfway to number 5, we have the Arab-Khazar Wars. And now the Arab-Khazar Wars were a series of conflicts fought between the armies of the Khazar Khaganate and the Umayyad Caliphate. Arab-Khazar military confrontation involved several sporadic raids and isolated battles, and this happened over a period from the middle of the 7th century to the end of the 8th century. The Arab-Khazar Wars were a result of the attempts of the Umayyad Caliphate to secure control over Transcaucasia, as well as North Caucasus, where the Khazars were already established. Now the first Arab invasion in the 640s and early 650s ended with the defeat of an Arab force led by Abd ar-Rahman ibn Rabia. Number 4 brings us the Arab-Byzantine Wars. Now these Arab-Byzantine Wars were a series of wars between the mostly Arab Muslims and the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire between the 7th and the 11th centuries. It started during the initial Muslim conquest under the expansion under the Rashidun and Umayyad Caliphs in the 7th century and continued by their successors until mid-11th century. Now the eruption of the Arabs from the Arab Peninsula in the 630s resulted in the rapid loss of the southern provinces under the control of the Byzantines. Over the next 50 years, under the aggressive Umayyad Caliphs, the Muslims would launch repeated attacks into still Byzantine Asia Minor, twice threatened the Byzantine capital Constantinople with conquest, and then outright conquered it. And number 3 brings us the conquest of Persia. The Muslim conquest of Persia, also known as the Arab conquest of Iran, led to the end of the Sasanian Empire in 651 and eventually the decline of the Zoroastrian religion in Iran. Arabs first attacked the Sassanid territory in 633 when the general Khalid ibn Walid invaded Mesopotamia, which was the political and economic center of the Sassanid state. Following the transfer of Khalid to the Roman front in the Levant, the Muslims eventually lost their holdings to Iranian counterattacks. Now, the second invasion began in 636 under Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, when a key victory at the Battle of Qadisiyah led to a permanent end of the Sasanian control west of Iran. And then we have the conquest of Egypt. So at the start of the Muslim conquest of Egypt, Egypt was part of the Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire, which had its capital at Constantinople. Egypt had been conquered just a decade before by the Persian Empire. However, Emperor Heraclius recaptured it after a series of campaigns against the Sassanid Persians, only to lose it to the Muslims 10 years later. Now, one thing to note that before the Muslim conquest of Egypt had even begun, the Eastern Romans had already lost the Levant and its Arab ally, the Ghassanid kingdom, to the Muslims. All this left the Eastern Roman Empire dangerously exposed and completely vulnerable. And then finally at number 1, let's talk about it, the Muslim conquest of the Levant. We touched on this a little bit, but let's get into more detail. So the Muslim conquest of Syria occurred in the first half of the 7th century and refers to the conquest of the region known as Levant, later to become the Islamic province of Bilad al-Sham. And Arab Muslim forces had appeared on the southern borders even before the death of the Islamic prophet Muhammad in 632, resulting in the Battle of Mustah in 629. But the real invasion began in 634 under his successors, the Rashidun caliphs Abu Bakr and Umar ibn Khattab, with Khalid ibn al-Walid as their most important military leader. We begin this episode off at number 10, Dawah. During ancient times, Muslims used dawah, or inviting others to engage with the message of Islam. Prophet Muhammad, he preached to people individually, but as most of Makkah belonged to the elite class, they saw the message as a threat to their political, religious, and social and economic status in Makkah. However, despite the hostile position of the Meccan leaders, the message of Islam gradually attracted not only the weak and poor of Mecca, but many of the elite people themselves. After that, Prophet Muhammad began preaching the message and teaching the Quran, which made the religion spread. Islam also spread through Sufism. Sufism contributed to the Islamization not only in Central Asia but also in Kashmir, a disputed territory in the Himalayas foothills with population of upwards of 95% Muslim. Sufism came during the period of the Fatimid Caliphate, and the Sufis started preaching Islam from the time of the Delhi Sultanate to the Mughal era in the Indian subcontinent. Sachal Sarmat, Baba Bule Shah, Shah Wali Ullah, and Data Ganj Baksh are some of the prominent Sufis who helped align the local values and the practices with Islamic teachings. Next, at number 8, we're going to be looking at the spread of Islam throughout Asia. Islamic groups maintained control of most Asian land for a long period of time. Arab Muslims spread Islam into Turkish and Persian kingdoms, which then expanded into Central Asia. In Central Asia, Islam gradually spread as cultures and ethnic groups mixed together. And now today, when we look, most of Central Asian nations are actually Islamic nations now. Muslims conquered part of South Asia from India to Bangladesh and began the Delhi Sultanate. Now, in the year 1526, the Mughal Empire descended from the Mongolians, expanded the Muslim territory, and filled the southern Asian land with Muslim art and architecture. From there, let's talk about the spread in Indonesia and China. Most of Indonesia converted to Islam under the influence of the Sufis in the 13th century. Islam also spread through merchant activities by Arab Muslim traders and adoption by local rulers. And today, Indonesia has the highest Muslim population in the entire world. And that comes as a surprise to a lot of people because most people think that most Muslims are in Arab countries, but that's actually not the case. Either way, Islam reached China also during the Tang and Song dynasties from 618 to 1279 via the overland and the maritime Silk Roads. Arabian and Persian traders built tombs and mosques combining traditional Arab and Chinese architectures, intermarried with local Chinese, and also raised the first generation of Chinese-speaking Muslims. However, only 2% of China's population is Muslim today. Alright, for number 6, let's look at the spread of Islam in Africa. Islam entered Africa from different places. First, Arab traders came from Asia into North Africa and moved through the Sahara to West Africa. The first African converts to Islam were merchants in Sudan, followed by some kings and their royal courts. However, the peasants initially maintained their local faiths and converted after some time to Islam. Gao was the first place where the king of Ghana converted, and then Muslims established a kingdom in Mali from the 13th century to the 15th century. Mansa Musa was the king of Mali, and he built the capital city called Timbuktu, where Muslim scholars taught and wrote Islamic law. For fact number 5, I gotta mention Ibn Battuta. Cities developed in the places where African traders met Arab traders, and as the towns grew, the Muslims started building mosques to give the cities some shape. Now, the records about the spread came from Arab sources, such as the great Arab traveler Ibn Battuta, who traveled from Western Africa to Eastern China throughout his life, probably more than Marco Polo or any other explorer at that time. Now, let's look at the rise of Islam over in Europe. Islam expanded in the Caucasus through the Muslim conquest of Persia in the 7th century and entered southern Europe through the expansion of the Umayyad conquest of Hispania in the 8th to 10th centuries. Muslim political entities, they existed firmly in what is today Spain, Portugal, Sicily, and Malta during the Middle Ages. And the Ottoman Empire, they further expanded into southeastern Europe, and it consolidated its political power by invading and conquering huge portions of the Serbian Empire, the Bulgarian Empire, as well as all of the remaining territories of the Byzantine Empire in the 14th and 15th centuries. Many Muslims also migrated to Western Europe in the late 20th century, as well as the early 21st century. And that actually leads us to number 3, migration. Migration, both forced and voluntary, has played an important role in the spread of Islam. The earliest presence of Muslims outside of Arabia was a group of Muslims who sought refuge in Abyssinia during the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad. This is one of the very famous stories about the life of Prophet Muhammad. Similarly, forced migration brought the first Muslims to the New World through the transatlantic slave trade, laying the foundations for an early Muslim presence in the Americas. The forced migrants became distant from Islam, but then they returned to mainstream Islam en masse, starting in the late 1970s. Also, intermarriage between Muslims and non-Muslims also became a source of the spread of Islam in different parts of the world. One prominent case was that of Sarah, the daughter of Alamund of the Visigothic royal family. Now, she was married twice to prominent Muslims, and in later centuries her descendants formed some of the leading Muslim families of Seville, including the Banu Hajjaj and the Banu Maslama. Similar marriages happened in the Ottoman Empire and in India and also the United States, where Muslims married non-Muslims, and it gave rise to Islam in various different regions. Now, we end this episode off with number 1, conquests. Islam spread through the reign of the second Caliph Umar, who held power from 634 to 644. And the Rashidun Caliphate constructed a massive empire out of many swift military victories and gave rise to people embracing the religion of Islam. After the Rashidun, the Umayyad dynasty and the Abbasid dynasty helped increase the conversion to Islam. The Umayyads did not actively encourage conversion, but when the Abbasids rebelled and gained control, Islamic art and culture started to flourish in the land, and they are famous for initiating the Islamic Golden Age. Today, the Muslim majority regions of Europe are Bosnia and Herzegovina, Albania, Kosovo, parts of Macedonia, and Montenegro, as well as some Russian regions. The communities consist predominantly of indigenous Europeans of the Muslim faith, whose religious traditions date back several hundred years. The transcontinental countries of Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Kazakhstan also are Muslim majority countries. But as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, Muslims are a relatively small minority in Europe. However, in some countries such as France and Sweden, the Muslim population is a little bit higher than other places. This has led to political and social agitation in several countries in Europe. Even more so now because of the millions of asylum seekers in recent years, many of them being Muslims. The Muslim population in Europe has been increasing steadily and will continue to grow in the coming decades. From mid-2010 to mid-2016 alone, the total amount of Muslims in Europe rose more than 1%, from 3.8% to 4.9%, and that's 19.5 million to 25.8 million. And by the year 2050, Europe's Muslim population could be more than double, rising to 11.2% or more, depending on the level of migration that's allowed in Europe. Even if for some reason future migration is permanently stopped, the Muslim population still would rise to an estimated 7.4%. This is due to the relative youth and the high fertility rates of the current Muslims living in Europe. Muslims are much younger and have more children on average than other Europeans. In the year 2016, the median age of Muslims throughout Europe was 30.4, and that's 13 years younger than the median for other Europeans, and that's 43.8 years old. Looking at it in another way, 50% of all European Muslims are under the age of 30, compared with 32% of the non-Muslims in Europe. In addition, the average Muslim woman in Europe is expected to have 2.6 children, a full child more than the average non-Muslim at 1.6 children. Also, one thing to note, between mid-2010 and mid-2016, migration was the biggest factor driving the growth of Muslims in Europe. An estimated 2.5 million Muslims came to Europe for reasons other than asylum seeking, such as for employment or going to school. About 1.3 million more Muslims received or are expected to receive refugee status, allowing them to remain in Europe, and an estimated 250,000 Muslims left the region during this time period. When it comes to natural growth, well, that's the secondary driver when it comes to the growth of the Muslim population. Among European Muslims, there were 2.9 million more births than deaths during this time period. Religious switching is estimated to be a small factor in the Muslim population change, roughly 160,000 more people switching away from Islam than converting to Islam within that same time period. Another thing to note is that views of Muslims vary widely across European countries. The European Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia reports that the Muslim population tends to suffer Islamophobia all over Europe, although the perceptions and views of Muslims may vary. In 2016, the Pew Research Center surveyed 10 nations and found that negative views about Muslims really prevailed in Eastern and Southern Europe. However, the majority of those in the UK, Germany, France, and Sweden, as well as the Netherlands, gave Muslims a favorable rating. And one interesting observation is that views about Muslims are tied to ideology. So check this, while 47% of Germans on the political right gave Muslims an unfavorable rating, just 17% of those on the left did the same. When it came to employment, according to the WZB Berlin Social Science Center, it showed that Muslims in Germany, France, and the Netherlands, United Kingdom, Belgium, Switzerland, and Muslims generally in Europe have higher levels of unemployment, which is largely due to the lack of language skills as well as a lack of inter-ethnic social ties, and in some cases the traditional gender role view where women aren't supposed to work outside of the home, only men do. But that was a very small factor in these countries. Also, discrimination from employers attributed to a small portion of unemployment. And the final thing I want to share is that according to the Pew Research Center in 2018, most Europeans were in favor of restrictions on face covering veils. An estimated 13 out of 15 people favored a ban of face face-covering veils in Western Europe. As opposed to politicians and intellectuals, people perceive Islamic dress to not represent religious symbols, but to represent ideology in the form of Islamism, which they feel is intended to extend its influence into society and politics.